Welcome to another episode of Raph's Retro Comics. In this episode, we're going to talk about the most valuable comic books and why they are valuable. Stay tuned. So, what are the most valuable comic books? In my previous episode, I talked about the 5 C's that drives collectors for comic books, and they were characters, content, covers, creators, and community. Now, by and large, the strongest driving factor in terms of determining value of a comic book, or what drives the value of a comic book, are characters. And if you look at the most 5 valuable comic books, you'll see that they're usually like the first appearance of a major character. So what are the 5 most expensive comic books? They would be Action number 1, which is the first appearance of Superman. Detective Comics number 27, the first appearance of Batman. Captain America number 1, first appearance of Captain America. Amazing Fantasy number 15, first appearance of Spider-Man. And Superman number 1. Now, Superman number 1 is not the first appearance of Superman, but it's the first comic book that's dedicated to a single character, a superhero, and which is Superman in this case. Now, the values of these comic books fluctuate greatly. So, interestingly, the most expensive comic book ever sold was Superman number 1, and I believe it went for more than $5 million instead of Action number 1. And the reason for that is some of these Golden Age comic books in high grade are extremely rare. And so the Superman number 1 sold more recently, and it was the best known copy, versus an Action 1 which sold, for a few years ago for like north of $3 million. Now, an Action number 1 in very high grade is going up for auction soon, and who knows, it may exceed that price of the Superman number 1. And I'm sure if the highest graded copy of Detective Comics 27 went up for sale, it would be interesting to see how much that goes for as well. Captain America Comics number 1 and Amazing Fantasy 15 are Marvel characters. And the interesting thing about Amazing Fantasy 15 is it's not as old as those 4 other comics that I mentioned. It actually came out, I believe, in 1962 or 63, versus like Action 1 that came out in 1938. There are other books that kind of go in and out of the top 5. I mean, like Batman number 1 is a very expensive book. And recently, like the first appearance of Wonder Woman sold for north of $1 million. So it's certainly like it's kind of crazy to think about it, but there are a lot of comic books that sell for more than $1 million. Where in my earlier years of collecting, like I never would have thought that these prices would ever be like achieved for these books. So you can see that major first appearances of comic books will drive the value up quite a bit for a comic book. But don't get too excited. You just can't find these books anywhere, and the value of these books have been long established. Like when I first started collecting comic books a long time ago, and I found out about these old Golden Age comic books like Action 1 or Detective 27, they were already very expensive. Not to the level they are now, but certainly far beyond my reach. Okay, so now that I've mentioned these extremely rare and valuable comic books, what about like other comic books in general? Let's see if you can determine from these 2 examples which ones are more valuable. So my first example here is a Classics Illustrated number 1. This particular edition came out in about 1953. It's the first issue featuring the 3 Musketeers, and the condition is kind of like a lower mid-grade comic book. So it's complete, nothing is missing, but it certainly has some visible wear on it. Quite an interesting book. 1953, so like it's more than 70 years old. All right. And the second example here I'm going to show you is Sergeant Fury number 74. This came out, I believe, in 1969 or 1970, and it's actually a pretty high-grade book. It's in really nice shape for the age that it's in. So 50-plus years old, a character that you may be familiar with. This is actually Nick Fury from the Marvel Universe, but before he became the head of S.H.I.E.L.D., when he was basically a sergeant in the Army. So if you look at these two books, which one do you think is more valuable? The answer might surprise you, and the answer is neither. And you would think, oh wow, like a 70-year-old comic book, first issue, okay condition, must be worth something. I actually bought this for $3 fairly recently. That's $3 Canadian, which is like $2 and change US. And the truth is, Classics Illustrated don't hold a lot of value unless they are the first edition, or like one of the more kind of rare editions that they didn't reprint very much. The first issue they've reprinted several times. Like, I want to say more than a dozen times they've reprinted this issue. And even though it's old, because there are so many reprints of this available, and in general, Classics Illustrated are just really not that popular among comic book collectors, it just doesn't hold a lot of value. It's not saying that there aren't classic comics collectors out there. There certainly are, but really like the going rate for this kind of book, even though it's like 70-plus years old, is not a lot. I'm certainly happy to pay what I paid for this, and it's probably worth more than $3, but not really that much more. So yeah, not worth a heck of a lot. Well, what about the Sergeant Fury? Now, he's a more well-known character. He's in the Marvel Universe, but Sergeant Fury is just not a popular title, even though it's a Marvel title, even though this is 50-plus years old. I think I paid like a couple bucks for this, like a few years ago. Comic book dealers at conventions or stores will tell you that Sergeant Furies, they just don't sell unless they're for like a couple bucks, $2-3. Then they might move, even if they're in nice condition. So although in both these cases, if you were to kind of consult the comic book price guide here, the book, what I call like the book value in the Overstreet price guide, would list it at a higher value. And it's possible, certainly in some markets, these books will go for more money. They just don't hold a lot of value. And this holds true for the vast majority of comic books, whether they're recent or old. The vast majority of comic books just don't have a lot of value. And that's not saying that there are not a lot of comic books that do have value, but, just the run-of-the-mill, run-fillers, titles, especially from the 80s and 90s, you just find in the dollar bins at a lot of conventions or stores. And I think that's great, because I think cheap comic books allow a really easy entry into the hobby. And certainly if you're new to the hobby, I would, dig those dollar bins. Like, find the cheapy books. Like, there's, like, the way I grew up was buying a lot of these books in the cheapy bins. And, sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you find something that's maybe more valuable. But, you buy the comic books to collect, to enjoy, to read. And so there's still a lot of comic books out there that are still cheap and available. So it's easy for new people to get into the hobby. That being said, like what do I collect? I mentioned a number of characters like Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, Captain America. These are all very popular characters. What has driven me to collect certain characters? And as a collector who's kind of changed tastes over time, often, like, for me, it'll be about opportunity. If I come across, especially older comic books that are what I consider to be very affordable, very reasonable, I may collect them. And so a few years ago, I started collecting this one DC title that nobody collects. Well, I shouldn't say nobody, but it's not a very popular title. And so I was asking my friends, it's like, oh, guys, like I just recently stumbled upon like a number of these older DC books. And I said, what do you think is the worst DC title from the 60s that lasted more than 50 issues? And so, you know, there are a lot of DC titles from the Silver Age that are just not very popular, or they're very slow to sell. So I can mention a few, like Challengers of the Unknown. You know, it lasted quite a long time, but not very popular with characters. Well, another run could be like Jimmy Olsen's Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, which lasted well over 100 issues, but is not widely popular or collected. So what did I pick up? What's in the box? What did I start collecting? Let's find out. So the title that I started collecting is this, Blackhawk. So Blackhawk debuted in the 1940s, originated from the golden age of comic books. So the reason why I got into Blackhawk was because I was at a store, and they had recently got in a collection of older comic books, and one was a run of Blackhawk. Not a complete run. A lot of issues were missing, as well as like some of them were coverless or whatnot, but they were very reasonably priced. And the reason why is because the person who runs the back issue department knows what the local market is, and he knows that Blackhawk is not a good seller, so he discounted the title pretty heavily. And as well, this was like an original owner collection, and you know, a person who had collected this title for many years, and it was his son that was selling this collection to the store. So in some ways I kind of felt pity on this title, which is maybe something you shouldn't do, but so there I was, a bunch of old Blackhawk comic books, and I love old comic books, and the price was right, so I just jumped right in. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this issue of Blackhawk. So here's Raf's Crap Comic of the Week, Blackhawk number 17. Now these earlier issues of Blackhawk do have some value, and interestingly, Blackhawk was featured in another title at the same time, Military Comics, which was then turned into Modern Comics. So he was certainly a very popular character in the 40s, all the way through the 50s and into the 60s. So let's take a look inside. Now, with Golden Age comic books of this age, you have to be kind of careful because often, like, the paper quality can be kind of fragile. This one's actually not too bad. As you can see, somebody was lucky enough to buy this for $1.50. So, the earlier issues of Blackhawk had artwork by Reed Crandall, one of the all-time greats. This issue actually has artwork by Bill Ward, who is much better known for his kind of what we call good girl art, specifically a title called Torchy. And he would do backup stories in Torchy in the other Blackhawk title in Modern Comics. So who is Blackhawk? Blackhawk, his origin has changed. It's kind of hard to pin down, but he is part of this kind of multinational group of armed forces, kind of pilots, and in that group is Blackhawk himself. There's Andre the Frenchman, who's often kind of like the espionage guy. There is Stanislaw, or Stan, which is kind of Blackhawk's right-hand man. Olaf the Swede. Hendrickson, who's kind of like a sharpshooter, and the old crusty guy of the group. And Chuck, and a Texan. And it's interesting because they always refer to him as a Texan instead of as an American. And there's also Chop Chop, kind of like the comedy relief character of the group. And, looking back at some of these older issues of Blackhawk, they're kind of cringy because the stereotypes for Asian characters back then were, how would you say, not very politically correct. But he was actually a very popular, endearing character. And as you can see, like Bill Ward's artwork is actually quite good. Very nice lines, and you can kind of see how he developed into a popular artist specifically for drawing the female character. So Blackhawk, they were a team of multinationals. They had these different adventures, and you don't. It's kind of interesting in some of these issues. You don't see them fly their planes very much, but you know, they. Oh, actually, here you go. But again, Distracted by the Femme Fatale, drawn by Bill Ward. Blackhawk, the earlier issues were predominantly drawn by Reed Crandall, and who's kind of like certainly a master of his time at that time. But yeah, I love these old comic books. And here, like, Chop Chop actually has his own feature story in this issue. And when I tell you about how the Asian stereotypes for back then, you can just look at his word bubbles, like, oh, sword very old-fashioned. Tommy gonna do better job. So certainly wouldn't pass the mustard these days. But I think what's interesting in this particular issue is that Chop Chop runs into another fellow Chinese Asian person who's an actor in the show, and he speaks perfectly good English. I'm an actor in the play. My name is Tom Won. Why do you ask? An actor in a play, that give me a very good idea. So it's kind of interesting how they can kind of flip-flop. But certainly, you know, the teeth, the hair, you know, his costume, not the most what you would call appropriate depiction. But, you know, the other Asian characters in this play look, you know, pretty good. Often in a lot of these older comic books, there are full text stories, and sometimes they feature the characters of a comic book, and sometimes they're just kind of one-offs. And this is like a 2-page story of like a Blackhawk story. So yeah, like, love these older comic books. When I mentioned that these do have some value, like, I actually picked this up for, I think it was like $50 a while ago, which is not nothing, but if you compare this to other comic books from that time period, Blackhawks are pretty cheap, especially for what I consider like really good quality artwork and an interesting story. Now, if I were to recommend what to read now, is when Blackhawk was rebooted in the 80s, written by Mark Evanier and drawn by Dan Spiegel, starting with issue number 251. They do a great job of kind of bringing Blackhawk back to their roots, in fighting in the Second World War, because in the 60s it kind of shifted to this kind of adventure group that was really kind of silly. Certainly nostalgic, but kind of silly. But yeah, like the issues from 251, it did have a pretty good run. But certainly, you know, search those out if you're interested in reading more about Blackhawk. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Learned a little bit about Blackhawk as well as comic books and what drives the value of comic books. And I hope to see you in the next episode of Raph's Retro Comics. So long.